Hey there, welcome to Spirit and Truth Podcast. This is Lee Cummings, and we've been talking and discussing about Israel and the rising storm, really connected to what took place October 7th. What does the Bible have to say? What does history have to say? And what do we need to know theologically to be well-informed and prepared for what is both taking place, not just in Israel, but in major cities around the world where we see protests, pro-Palestinian protests. We see this being the primary conversation that's taking place both in the UN and in world court systems. And not just there, we're also seeing this become an increasing conversation in the church. There's been many decades where it seems like eschatology has either been pushed out to the fringe or in the popular fray. And many pastors and leaders have just kind of decided that this isn't a topic that they wanted to wade into. But in moments like this, where we see really the full attention span focusing in on the Middle East and the tension between Israel and the Palestinian people and the Arab nations of the world, it's an issue that we can't escape anymore. So I brought in a few guests. Today, I have a very good friend and author, Bible teacher, Joel Richardson. He has written many books that have been super helpful for me. Islamic Antichrist, The Middle East Beast, one that I think is one of the best books on this particular subject. I've given it out many times. It's called When a Jew Rules the World, from Sinai to Zion, and several podcasts teaching online on YouTube. It travels around and he teaches as well. As one of the best guys, smartest guys I know on this subject. Joel, thank you so much for being with us on Spirit and Truth.
Thank you so much, Lee. I appreciate it. You forgot to mention good looking. You didn't include that.
Well, I think if people are watching us on YouTube, that's obvious. It's an understatement. So the other thing I failed to mention is you're like this master craftsman. Like he rebinds Bibles. He's learning how to make icons. He works with wood. He's a painter, builder. He does that on the side in addition to teaching the Bible. So very skilled. I'm just glad you're not a musician, because then I would be extremely jealous.
No, definitely not a musician. Can't sing, but I do make my own sauerkraut. So I've got quite a suite of skills.
That pushes you over the edge right there. Hey, I specifically wanted to bring you on, Joel, and have this conversation about Israel, not just October 7th. I think for me, seeing what took place on October 7th, which was the greatest loss of life and probably one of the most significant attacks against Israel and the Jewish people since the Holocaust. But it's not as if everything was rosy leading up to that. I think a lot of people anticipated something like this taking place at some point. But what it did do was it brought it to the surface as a primary conversation for people across different spheres having to deal with the issue of Israel's sovereignty, their right to exist, their right to pursue their own destiny, and within the church, where do we stand on Israel? Israel has really become a test of where we stand on issues like inspiration of Scripture, replacement theology, the Jewish people. And one of the areas that you're a Bible teacher, prolific writer, and a voice to the body of Christ is the issue of eschatology. And it is making us understand, or at least grapple with the issue of where is this all going? I'm just curious, really practically, I would love to hear what your thoughts were when you woke up on October 7th and heard the news of what had taken place. How did that affect you? What were some of your first thoughts?
So I was actually in Saudi Arabia. I was 15 miles from the border. We were staying at a hotel right on the border of Jordan. So really only 15 miles from Eilat. And I was leading a tour, so I was sort of, distracted. I didn't want to even look at some of the things that I was seeing on social media, but it was overwhelming and emotional. In January 2020, I was actually with a group in Israel. We had a tour, and It was a specific tour where we were taking Christians to the different borders of Israel to help Christians understand the security dynamics that Israel is dealing with every day. And one of the things that we did is we went down to a community that was right there on the border of right next to Gaza. And the gentleman gave us a tour of his community and, talked about how his own kids and many of the kids had PTSD, literally from rockets hitting their kindergarten, this type of thing. The realities that they live with, just simply trying to raise their families someplace in the world where they're not hated. And then when all was said and done, we kind of did this little, we painted these tiles and we glued them up on this wall that faces Gaza, and it's intended to convey, messages of peace and this type of thing. A very small community. But I quickly got the news that there were over 20 people from that community who had been killed, and that was all within the first day.
Man.
So I was gripped. And to be honestly, emotionally, I've been gripped ever since. I actually have a very difficult time even reading news articles about the children, the kids, the teens that have been kidnapped, and the emotional toll that that's having on families and on the nation at large. And then to see the reaction of the world, essentially celebrating and championing this, one of the most barbaric, inhumane things that I've ever seen. I actually had a pretty significant conflict with a close friend of mine. He's a dear friend. He converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, and so he has embraced that sort of worldview of replacement theology, and there tends to be a lot of anti-Semitism in the Eastern Orthodox churches. And it got so heated, and he was saying, well, you're only espousing these particular views because of your sort of Protestant premillennial eschatology. And I said, no, this is my position because I'm a human. I'm a human who just watched family, people breaking bread on a Jewish holiday. It was Simchat Torah, and people bursting into their homes, murdering, raping, kidnapping, and killing, and this sort of thing. I don't care if those were, Muslims that was happening to. I would stand with the innocent families that were facing all of this. And yeah, to me, it's a very emotional subject.
What comes into your mind? I mean, so for me, I was on my way to Omaha, Nebraska. I woke up Saturday morning. Jay and I were having coffee. I was getting ready to head to the airport, and the news broke. And I was surprised, but in my mind, Israel's been under attack so many different times. They have, terrorist attacks that take place, whether it's at a disco or at a market, a bus station, at a border. I thought in my mind when it was first coming across the wire that that's what this was. So by the time I got to Omaha, and made my connections and got to my hotel room, I just could not believe, I could not fathom the scope of this attack and the strategic all-out assault that had taken place. And like you, I've been very emotional about it, just on a human level, just seeing the pain, the agony, the loss. But probably the thing that has surprised me the most is when I first saw it on the news, I thought surely, and naively so, but surely this is going to rally the international community around Israel, much like it did around the United States after 9/11. This is Israel's 9/11. I thought, well, surely this is going to change the dynamics between how the UN relates to them. This is going to change and put pressure on the Palestinian Authority in both the West Bank and in Gaza, towards a two-state solution, or some sort of pressure that maybe cleans things up a little bit. But in fact, what happened is the exact opposite. We begin to see these international bodies doubling down on Israel, protests erupting, anti-Semitic Jew hatred in major cities like London and Madrid and Berlin, of all places, Chicago, New York, LA, across the globe. Now we see South Africa going to the world courts trying to get them convicted for genocide. It's like, what in the world is going on? Where do you think that reaction, that level of hatred, where did that spring from? Is that new, or has that just been underlying the surface for a long time and this became an excuse for it?
No, it's far from anything new. So there's an interesting dynamic here. There's, of course, a whole academic field dedicated to the study of anti-Semitism, historical anti-Semitism. And what's interesting or terrifying about this particular, again, subset of academic studies is that right in the middle of it, there's this glaring, huge mystery. Because when you study anti-Semitism, let's just call it for what it is, Jew hatred of the Jewish people. Throughout history, you have, look, the Jewish people are the single most hated, persecuted, hunted, and murdered people in the history of mankind. There's no other people group that compare to this very small fraction of people. It's less than a fraction of 1% of the global population.
Yeah.
And yet the percentage of hatred that has been directed toward them, no other people group has been as targeted throughout history. But what's interesting is within this study, there is no consistency. So let's say you go all the way back to, Pharaoh killing the firstborn of every Israel Hebrew firstborn. You can start there and you can move forward throughout some of the historical examples. You get up into more modern times, you get into Christian Europe, persecuting, hating the Jewish people. You can get into Russian pogroms and so forth. That you get to the Holocaust. There is never any consistent reason why people hate the Jewish people. At one particular period in history, it could be for one particular reason. You could say, well, they really stood out because of their religious peculiarities.
Right.
They dressed this type of thing. But at another time, they were deeply integrated. They were as German as any of the other Germans, and yet they were targeted. So there's no consistent reason. And so here's the thing, is that for those who are studying this from a secular perspective, there's just this glaring mystery that they can't answer. And unless we have a spiritual view of these things, unless we recognize the fact that there is a very real malevolent, dark presence or being that we call the devil or Satan, there's no way to explain it. I guess it was Nietzsche who originally said, how does he say it? Well, I might be confusing the statements. There's one statement that says staring into the Holocaust is like staring at the black abyss and hoping that it doesn't stare back at you.
Right.
And this is the reality with anti-Semitism, is you cannot explain it apart from spiritual realities unless you understand the covenants that God has made with Israel, the unfolding story of redemption, and the reality of a very real devil. It doesn't make any sense. And even right now, even in the global Jewish community, there's kind of an awakening. I won't say to Christianity and Jesus Christ and this type of thing, but there's an awakening and even a hunger for God, if you will, because it stirs up something in them. And they go, there's a reason that we're hated, and it can only be explained if we understand what the Bible actually says about these things.
Yeah, it definitely is spiritual in its origin, and you can trace throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament this illogical, irrational hatred of the Jewish people. What's interesting to me is Paul in Thessalonians talks about the mystery of lawlessness pertaining to the Antichrist or the beast when he comes on the scene. But it seems like there's not just a mystery of lawlessness that is going to be pervasive at the end of the age. There's this mystery of Israel too, mystery of anti-Semitism that's going to come to a full manifestation, because it doesn't make sense but it's not going away. I would love for you to speak about where that Jew hatred that it's on every continent and every era. It doesn't matter where you go. It's been in the church. It's been in National Socialism. It's been under communism. It's been under capitalism. It's in Islam. It's not fostered in just one culture. Or one group of people. It's global and it's pervasive. Where is it going? I mean, so the question that a lot of people are asking is, okay, that was October 7th. We're wrestling with, is the answer a two-state solution? Is the issue just Hamas-centric? If we did get rid of Hamas, does that solve the problems? But I believe that, the Bible's pretty clear that it's not going away. I would love for you to just speak about where you see this going. Where's this Jew hatred, anti-Israeli spirit or mystery? Where's it going?
Yeah. So making reference to Paul's reference to the mystery of lawlessness, I think that's an important passage. Definitely one of the key passages is Isaiah 34. Isaiah 34 is an eschatological oracle prophecy against Edom. It's a judgment oracle against Edom. And of course, Edom was a historical kingdom in modern day southern Jordan. But in a lot of ways, in prophetic texts, it's sort of Edom comes to embody. It represents those who hate Israel. It's almost a spirit. It's much more than just again, this ancient kingdom. So it's talking about judgment on Edom in the context of the sky rolling up like a scroll, classic eschatological end of the age language. And it talks about the Lord slaughtering the people in Edom. He has a great sacrifice in the land of Edom. Their land will be soaked with blood and this type of thing. And then it says, because the Lord has a day of vengeance. So the Lord has a day set apart in his heart, sort of in his future plans. He has a day called the day of the Lord. And it's a day of vengeance. And it specifically says, for the controversy, or for the cause of Zion. And so I think that's an important passage to start from. You could go even further back and look at Moses and just sort of understand the covenants and the promises that God made, and understand that this hatred, this irrational hatred, it's ultimately, in very simplified form, a satanically inspired hatred of God. It's not just Israel. It's a hatred of God himself and his unfolding plan of redemption, because the people of Israel are right at the heart of it. The church today tends to have a very church-centric view of everything, but the Bible has much more of an Israel-centric perspective. And we, the Gentiles that we've been brought in, it's not to say that we're not important and central to the heart of God. We are. But we're kind of a secondary narrative. If you really understand the biblical narrative, we're really kind of a secondary narrative. We've been brought in. Israel is at the center. And so unless we understand the Lord's promises and the role of Israel in his unfolding plan to redeem and restore all things, then we won't understand this irrational and, yes, demonic hatred. So it starts out with God's promises, Satan's rage against God's promises, and quite frankly, the punctuated, just episodic explosion of that satanic hatred throughout history. It's one of the most consistent realities throughout human history. And I'll just reiterate, the only way that we can understand it properly is to understand the gospel, is to understand God's plan of redemption, the story that we're in the middle of right now.
Yeah, there's so many mysteries to this. There's so much that defies just intellectual knowledge or geopolitical. I mean, it's irrational to think that even a nation smaller than the size of New Jersey is central to global conflict. We've been able to put a man on the moon and send, satellites outside of our own solar system, but we can't resolve the issue of Israel, this small little sliver of a nation, and the issue of the Jewish people. So many people, I think, sit back and go, well, it's just very simple. divide the land and, put Israel or the Jewish people on one side and give the other to the Arab or the Palestinian people, and they should be at peace. And we hear even our own politicians talking about that calling for a two-state solution over and over and over again. But it's pretty clear from the Bible, number one, that God is going to judge people if they try to divide the land. But the real practical side of this, on the other side of it, is that the enemies of Israel are not interested in a two-state solution. They're not interested in anything connected to a two-state solution. They want essentially a final solution to destroy the Jewish people. From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. Well, free of what? Free of Jews' presence there in this land. And so it defies logic that that the whole world's attentions are on this small little piece of land. We can't solve that issue. Mix that with this ancient hatred that still is resident there. It's not going away, is it? I mean, this isn't something that's going to get resolved here in the next 6 months, or even if a certain individual or political party come into power again. That's not going to change the narrative of what's happening.
Right. So, as people assess this, they're often approaching it with the assumption that you're dealing with rational people, you're dealing with rational parties. And I don't want to frame, every Palestinian as irrational by any means, but there's very simple polls that you can look at and say, well, it's close to 70% of the Palestinian people do want to see, as you said, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free of the Jewish people. So you've got roughly 70% ish in that range who genuinely support a genocide. And so we need to be we need to be educated regarding the ideological foundations that are driving a lot of this. And so let's just start with the concept of replacement theology. As you know, Lee, probably half of the church, most of the church throughout history has embraced this view that the church is this body that has replaced Israel and God is done with Israel. They're no longer even a people, which is a profoundly racist view, by the way. Right. I mean, let's just say you say to any family, oh, you're Lee Cummings. No, actually, I'm the new Cummings. Huh. You're the old Cummings. Your family has been dissolved. It's God's will that you are no longer a people, that you're no longer a family, that it's God's will that you are permanently dissolved and exiled among the nations. You go, well, then what are we? Who are we then? Right. It's like God has dissolved you. That is a very racist view, and the church has embraced that. But then, of course, in the 7th century, after the church had already well tread this path, Islam came along, and they go, okay, let's just try to understand the religious landscape here. You've got the Jews, and then you've got the Christians that say they've replaced the Jews. And Muhammad came along and just said, I replace both of you. I replace all of you. And so Islam has its own form of replacement theology. Right. And so it's very important for us to understand that so much of what's driving this is Islamic ideology. And, even Hamas, look, we've got all these kids today, these, bright-eyed college kids that are joining the protests. They think this is the justice issue du jour of the day. And they genuinely think, by crying out against the Jewish people, they're standing against genocide or this type of thing. When you look at the very charter of Hamas, essentially their constitution, you have within the charter, you have an open statement that says peace initiatives, all of these ceasefires, these agreements, they're all worthless. They're not rooted in Islamic doctrine. Therefore, they're meaningless. They're just a joke. Like, it literally mocks the idea of having peace discussions or any of these things. And it also quotes a prophecy, which is a prophecy, an Islamic prophecy, allegedly made by Muhammad, that says the day of judgment will not come until the Muslims fight against the Jews and kill them, until there are only a few Jews left hiding themselves behind a tree or a rock, and then the tree or the rock will cry out and say, "O Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." And then it says Hamas exists, the Islamic resistance movement exists to fulfill this divine mandate. So we need to understand we're dealing with an ideology that says it is God's will that we carry out a genocide against the Jewish people. So you literally have these, again, bright-eyed Western liberal kids that are joining in these marches, calling for a racist genocide. Now, of course, Hamas is, kind of the worst of the worst, whether it's ISIS or Hamas or Iran. These are all groups that are functioning under that type of narrative, these type of prophecies. But then you have the larger Islamic world, which they may not fully embrace these calls to genocide, but embedded in their education, in their history, are these incredibly racist prophecies and views about Judaism or about the Jewish people driving it. So we need to understand that this is religious. We're dealing with, quite frankly, a genocidal racist cult that many people have been brainwashed. They're part of this cult. And if we're going to have a rational discussion, we can't even treat that as though it's logical or rational, even if it's a majority, even if, leaders of nations are talking this way. We need to call it for what it is and start from a place of simply being rational.
Yeah, Christians need, especially Christians in the West and politicians in the West, need to understand that they're looking at the situation through a lens and a worldview that the people who are the neighbors, in that rough neighborhood of the Middle East are not seeing it through that lens. And evangelical Christians who have been influenced by replacement theology or are ignorant, who are looking at this situation and think, well, there needs to be peace in the Middle East. They need to understand that not only do we have eschatology in our Bibles that prophesy about the end of the age and Israel being at the center of it, but so does Islam, both in the Quran and in the Hadith. Their traditions, they have really, really eerily similar eschatology, except it's the Jew being the enemy of Jesus as opposed to Jesus returning to defend the Jews. And so it's almost like you see this collision of two eschatological systems that are pointing at the same event, but looking at it from two different worldviews. And they very much believe, just like a Christian might believe, that our hope is Jesus returning to save the Jewish people and to establish his kingdom. Islam is looking at this like the end of the age is going to be marked by paradise, but it's going to be marked by the destruction of the Jewish people. So that's driving a lot of the conflict.
Yeah, and there's another factor here too. I'll say, Islam, the Islamic world, they're very good at understanding that this is not simply a war, of guns and tanks and bombs and this type of thing. It's a war. It's a propaganda war. And so, when you take the story of David and Goliath, you have one of the most sort of gripping archetypical narratives. You have the big giant, he's mocking, he's the pagan. And then you have the little underdog David, who takes him down with a simple stone and this type of thing. Everyone who hears that story identifies with the David. I don't think there's anyone out there that goes, oh man, I wish Goliath had killed that little punk. How many people identify with Goliath? But what the Palestinian people have done, they've been very, very successful in co-opting that narrative and framing the Palestinian cause as the little Davids, the underdogs against this big juggernaut. They'll always use pictures of the big Israeli tank and, these soldiers with all of this and this little Palestinian kid, quite frankly, I mean, oftentimes even with a sling in the images. So people identify with the poor underdog Palestinians. And the reality is, after the Holocaust, Israel rebuilt their nation. They said, never again. We're never going to trust these Gentiles again. We will become strong. And quite rightfully, they built a very strong military. And so the Palestinians use that imagery, but we need to recognize the fact that, yes, Israel has an incredibly strong military, but it is overwhelmingly a defensive force. Israel has no desire to invade neighboring nations. They're not an imperialist power. They have zero interest in they just simply want to be left alone to raise their families without people trying to kill them. And they've created a strong military to defend themselves. And so we often miss this reality. You know, people talk, for example, about how dangerous Christian eschatology is. Well, look, the reality is we believe that our divine defender is someday coming back from heaven to save us from persecution. We don't believe Jesus is coming back, to kill all of our enemies. I mean, we believe that he's coming back to kill those that are trying to kill us, to protect us. But again, it's defensive and it's passive. We are prayerfully awaiting a divine God-man, quite frankly, to come back from heaven and save us. It's not something that we're going to make happen. Islam, on the other hand, their eschatology, it's both aggressive, it's not defensive. They believe that they are, within the narrative, the aggressors that will attack and defeat and destroy the infidels. And it's not passive. They're not just sitting back waiting for God to make these things happen. They believe that they have to take that active role in aggressively and again, not passively attacking their enemies. So these things are important to recognize. Likewise, the biblical narrative is one of God coming back to save his people who are being hedged in from every direction. And this is what the biblical prophets describe, whether it's Zechariah 12 through 14, Joel 3, Ezekiel 38 through 39, various passages in Daniel. Is Israel being attacked by all of the surrounding nations, all of the nations of the world coming against Israel in the last days, and essentially 2 minutes to midnight, their God, their Messiah, their King comes back to save them. So we need to understand the biblical narrative and how it's playing out and how that's being twisted and preempted, if you will, by the propagandists.
Yeah, one of the interesting aspects to how you teach eschatology, it's been very helpful for me, as how you point out that the Bible is very Israeli centric. So it makes sense that the focal point of history, as it's coming to a culmination, is going to be pointed at Israel, because that's what the Bible is looking at. That's what God's looking at. And when you look at the landscape around Israel, all the nations that are around it, Israel, almost without exception, I don't think there's one that's not, are Islamic nations. And years ago, you wrote a book called The Islamic Antichrist, which I thought, when I first saw the title, I thought, well, this is kind of sensational. I've never really considered that. Then I dug into your book, and I went through every footnote. I went through every text, really studied it. Came away thinking this is very, very intriguing. How convinced are you at this point that as we see this rise of anti-Semitism, the war in the region that seems to just escalate, how convinced are you that this is going to lead ultimately to what we know as time of Jacob's trouble at some point in the future, that's going to be initiated both by the Islamic Confederation of Nations that are surrounding it, maybe some that are present, some that are not involved, and that what we know as the man of lawlessness, the son of perdition, Antichrist himself, will be the embodiment of that, and probably have some background in Islam or be a Muslim in a very formal sense?
Yeah, and that's a good question. So when I talk about my sort of paradigm for understanding the last days, I think the best way to begin is just to say it's an Israel-centric perspective, which is to say the context of the Bible is Israel. Everything revolves around Israel. The story hinges on Israel. It ultimately culminates with Jesus coming back to rule the world from Jerusalem as the King of Israel and ultimately over the whole world. So obviously that's the center of everything. And then you simply look at biblical geography.
Right.
You look at, the prophets name names, they point to tribes, peoples, regions, and it's always the nations that surround Israel. So you begin there and you go, well, the Antichrist, his empire and his religion is going to primarily come out of the nations that surround Israel, Middle Eastern, North African nations. So then you just take the next step and you say, well, the overwhelming vast majority of them are Muslim majority nations. Yes, you've got Christian minorities in Syria and Egypt and Jordan to a degree, but really Muslim majority nations. And then so you just kind of go, well, who is most likely to lead these nations? Is it, you start dealing with their religion, their ideology. Is it going to be a communist? Well,
Right,
probably not
right.
a communist. Is it going to be a Christian? Probably not. So yeah, it'll most likely be a Muslim. Now, what will be taking place inside the Antichrist heart? I have no idea. What will the motivations of his heart? What will his true ideology be? I don't know. Maybe he'll be a cynic who will use Islam. I look, for example, at the president of Turkey today, President Erdogan. Look, I view him as overwhelmingly a Turkish nationalist who uses
Right.
Islam for his Turkish nationalist end goals. Is he a Muslim? Yeah, I think he's a Muslim, but he's first and foremost a Turkish nationalist. He wants to see the revival of the Ottoman Empire, the revival of Turkish power regionally, and this type of thing. And so I look at that as kind of a model. I go, that's probably something like the Antichrist. The book of Daniel says that he'll essentially worship a god of war or a god of forces or
Right.
fortresses or this type of thing. Um, is he a true Muslim at heart? Look, I don't want to analyze. I don't care to even analyze what will take place in the Antichrist's heart. I can only start out with the basics and say most likely he will be a Muslim who will use Islam to gather the surrounding nations under one umbrella and obviously against that mutual enemy, that mutual hatred of Israel. It's one of the most unifying things in the world is a mutual hatred, a mutual enemy. And Israel has been a
Yeah.
very convenient enemy to focus on.
Yeah. I thought it was really intriguing. And I think it's very valid because, like for many people, I grew up thinking that the empire of the Antichrist, and there's so many different books that have been written on it. You have to take them with a grain of salt, but really looked at it as a revived Roman Empire. And I could never figure out, okay, how is what's going on in Europe going to impact what's taking place in the Middle East? How are they going to bypass the influence of Islam and Arabic culture that has surrounded Israel? How is it going to be that Europe comes in the midst of that? And I think today, one of the unique things about what we're seeing, even in this most recent, most acute assault and war that's taking place, is you can now see how it is it's primarily Muslim nations and Islamic ideology that's fueling these terrorist organizations that are hell-bent on the destruction and the removal of Israel and the destruction, annihilation of the Jewish people. That it really is becoming the fuel in the Middle East for anti-Semitism is Islam, but that fuel is now showing up in the West. A friend of mine's in New York, and he just had the street that he's on in Manhattan shut down completely because of protesters, pro-Palestinian protesters. I said, how many of them do you think were Middle Eastern? How many of them were, white New Yorkers? And he said, at least 60% were Middle Eastern. And I just thought, here we are in New York in the West, where we have a large immigrant base, a lot of people that have moved here, a lot that have come in illegally, a lot that have come in legally. But yet Islam has maintained almost its own sovereign identity and their loyalty to the Ummah, to the Islamic community, even though they're here. And so when you start thinking about globally, how is it that an Antichrist figure is going to draw all the nations of the world and their focus, or at least portions of it, and influence the nations of the world in a way that brings such pressure on Israel at the end of the age, even far more intense than what we're seeing right now? Then all you got to do is look up and see the immigration levels and the influence that they're having on major universities, in the media, and among younger generations of even American liberal progressive mindsets. What do you think about how Islam right now is even impacting Western students in Ivy League and major universities?
Yeah, this is an excellent point because the reality is what we have is we really have two cultures that are intersecting or clashing at the same time. And on the Islamic side, we need to recognize and this is very foreign to most Westerners, but when you read the Quran, it repeatedly says things like, you are the best of peoples. You Muslims are the best of peoples. You have the best religion. You have the best prophet. You have the best book. Allahu Akbar. God, the God of the Quran is the greatest. He's greater. And it comes across as incredibly insecure, by the way. It's kind of like, well, I think you're protesting too much. You're constantly droning on about how you're better, you're greater. But this is the mindset. So you have this Islamic world, and then you have their prophecies, which say someday you're going to conquer the world. Why? Because you have the best religion. You have the one true religion. You're the best peoples. And then in the West, and look, the West is founded upon Judeo-biblical, Christian principles. One of these principles is confession. It's contrition, it's humility. And of course, Satan pushes that too far. So, even in the West, which is largely, more secular now, we still have those foundations. So we value things like humility, confession, admitting our mistakes.
Yeah.
And so you have the Western world, which, you have this very culturally confident people, the Islamic world, which is immigrating to the West because we're, a very open people, welcoming people, that sort of thing. And you have the Western world, which is, we're groveling. Anyone who's been educated by the West, we're very ashamed of who we are. Now, look, we've made a lot of mistakes, rightly so, but you take this contrition, and Satan will always push it too far to where we feel horrible about who we are. We have zero cultural confidence. When you look at the Constitution of the United States, and I don't mean to sound too, start sounding too nationalist or this type of thing, but the reality is the values that are enshrined in our Constitution, the values of equality, of liberty. These are principles that are good, that are worth fighting for, they're worth dying for. And yet, obviously we failed. We failed to live up to these ideals many, many times, and we're aware of that, but we've gone so far in the other direction. So you have this very weak culture, which feels horrible. We're ashamed of who we are. You have this confident culture clashing. And the bottom line is we roll the red carpet out for them, and they run rough trot right over us. And so they're sort of eating up our kids, if you will. Our kids have been hamstrung. Their ability to think critically, it's destroyed by moral and cultural relativity. And then you have this other culture, which is just incredibly confident. They believe they have the truth.
Yeah.
And we're getting destroyed. We're getting eaten up. So you have the spidery tentacles of Islam, because only a religion is powerful enough to have that type of global impact. Right. There's no other unifying ideology that could have a global reach other than Islam. So, we're seeing it right in front of us. And, I would even add, Lee, even as I'm talking, I'm thinking, I think of unbelievers out there right now. How would unbelievers interpret this particular conversation? The reality is the ideological landscape, the geopolitical landscape, that the prophets, you're talking 3,000 years ago, in that range, that they described would sweep the earth in the last days. Like, you have to be an awfully determined skeptic to deny that what we're seeing unfold right now is not what the prophets described. Yeah. And it's a painful reality, but yet it's one of the most validating realities that validates the Bible, the reliability of the Bible, the fact that the Bible is divine, is this global Jewish hatred, this hatred of the Jewish people globally. And for unbelievers, you have to say, explain it. Explain that. Explain how the prophets, how Moses declared that Israel would be exiled among the nations and eventually they would return. That's happened twice in Israel's history. It's never happened to any other people group in the history of mankind. And yet here it is, Israel, right in front of us. The prophets said that in the last days, all of the nations would turn against the Jewish people. Explain that. Yeah. Explain that. The reality is they can't. So there's multiple things here that we could zero in on.
Well, and as much that's evidence, it's evidence to the unbeliever, but it should also be hope to the believer. That even as we begin to see these things happen, yes, we need to we need to be friends, and we need to pray, and we need to provoke Israel unto jealousy. We need to be there. We shouldn't rejoice in their suffering. Our heart should be broken for them and with them, because Jesus is. But at the same time, this is part of our hope as we begin to see that. And just as you just really well laid out, that, 4,000 years of prophetic predictions, we're watching it happen. This should cause us to lift up our head and know that the end is not this thing spinning out of control and the Antichrist dominating. The end is Jesus returning, the salvation of all of Israel, and his kingdom being established in a restoring and renewal of all things. And that is our hope. And so we should not be discouraged. We should be sober-minded. We should be prayerful, but we should not be overwhelmed. Joel, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. Man, this has gone very quickly. Appreciate you so much. If people want to find out more of your teaching and your books, where can they find you at?
So my website is joelstrumpet.com. I should actually have a new website up here even within the next week or so. I've got a lot of free resources. All of my books are available for free as PDF files, a lot of free articles. And then, of course, I've got a YouTube channel, Joel Richardson. And so between the YouTube channel and my website, a lot of free material.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Joel. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Lee. Blessings to you.